Hey guys, welcome back. This is the third and final video in our pancake mix series. If you haven't seen the other two videos yet, I think you'll want to watch those first. I'll link those up here. In those videos, we designed the packaging that you see right here. And this video is going to be all about turning these into realistic mock-ups and making an awesome presentation. So let's get started. And as you'll remember, we designed both of these images on top of these bag mock-ups. Right now, these obviously look really flat. They don't maintain any of the lighting or shadow on the original bag. And so for the first step in this process, we're going to add that detail back in. We're going to do the back first. So let's go ahead and start by putting the image of the bag over top of our design. So what we want to do is separate the shadows in the bag from the highlights. So to do that, we're going to make one more copy of the bag and we'll hide that. So in the original bag image, we're going to change that to multiply. And now notice we can start to see some of the shapes in our bag, but the entire thing got really dark. It also turned the image really brown because the majority of that bag image was brown. So we can fix the color issue by turning this image black and white. And that's just done with an adjustment layer. And now we want to make it so that we only see the darker parts of this image. So if we open up our blend if options, we can make it so that the lighter parts of this layer don't appear. You'll see as we drag that down, some of that darkness starts to fade away. And we can split this handle to make those transitions smoother. And we'll just adjust this so we can still see some of that shadow detail without it being too overbearing. Now another thing we can do to get some extra fine control is to add a levels adjustment layer on top of this. And then we can just adjust the darks and lights that are shown in that layer, and that'll help us customize the look even further. And there's a few spots that are a little too dark, so we can just mask away this layer. So now we've made those areas a lot more visible. For the next step, to add in the lighter parts, we're going to use that copy of the bag we had made originally, change its blend mode to hard light, we'll turn it black and white, and again we'll use that blend if to hide the darker parts and make sure only the lighter parts are showing. And just like before, we'll add a levels adjustment layer, and then we'll fine tune things a bit. And notice in this lighting that we've added, we keep some of the same texture that the paper had originally, and that's what we want because our image is going to be printed on top of this type of paper, and that paper texture will still show through. Now there are a few areas here to where it may be a little too spotty, so once again we can just mask those out a little bit. And that's pretty much it. You can see what it looked like before and then after the lighting's added. It's a pretty big difference and it actually looks like it's printed on the bag now. Now I'm just gonna quickly do the exact same process to the front of the bag. And just as a small another note, the reason that you can see the shadows behind these bags is because I have another copy of that bag image directly underneath them. So see, we can turn on and off that shadow whenever we want. And now moving forward, we can start to figure out how to set up our scene. We want something to showcase the designs on these bags. So that means they need to be the focal point and everything else in the background needs to support them. And as for a background, my mind instantly thinks we should try to put these on some type of countertop. I don't think we really want a modern countertop though. We want something that feels a little more old so it better matches the packaging. So I'm gonna go look around and see what I can come up with. And here's the image I ended up finding. I think this is absolutely perfect for our case. We've got a nice rustic countertop that has lighting so that it brings focus to whatever's in the foreground. And the back of this is so dark, it's kind of just tucked away. So if we drag this beneath our mock-ups and stretch it so it fits the entire scene, then that'll work as a really good foundation. A lot of times it's good to use some extra objects to help support your main material, but you want them to be subtle enough to where they're not visually distracting and taking your attention away from the main product you're showcasing. And in this case, we can take our background as inspiration for what types of props to use, as well as our actual product. And when it comes to pancake mix, one of the things you're going to use is some type of spoon to get the mix out with. So I think it'd be cool to have some type of old school spoon that's laying on the counter, and I think this spoon will work perfectly. Now one reason I picked this is because the perspective lines up really well with our countertop. As you can see, the counter isn't perfectly flat. We can see above it a little bit, and it's very close to the same view as our spoon. We can just place that somewhere to our scene. I'm thinking roughly right in the center. And we just want to make sure we don't cover up any of the important information on the bag, like this text or imagery. And another thing to remember is we want the size of our props to make sense compared to the size of our package. Now I think it'd be cool to add some mix inside of this spoon so it's like we've just scooped some out of the bag. And just like we did on the back of the package, we're going to use a stock image of flour to represent our pancake mix, since both of them look very, very similar. So I'm just going to roughly remove the background from this. I'm going to scale that down to size. Now we can zoom in here and cut away some of these parts we don't want to see. And as you can see, part of this mix is covering up some of the text on our packaging, so we're going to want to reshape this mound to where it doesn't do that. And one thing we're going to do as we reshape this is make it so that the back of this spoon is completely visible. And that'll just help us sell the illusion that the powder is actually inside of the spoon. We're going to leave some of it spilled over onto the counter. And just to help this look a bit more realistic, if we look at our original image, you'll notice we have a few larger lumps of flour. So what we can do is just remove those and place them around the base of this spill, and that'll just help make it feel like this mix really did spill out onto this countertop. And to do that, I'm actually just going to mask out the clumps that we want to keep. and we can invert that mask, and we're left with just the clumps. Now we can reposition that and get rid of some of these we don't really need, and just sort of help this blend in. And maybe just to help echo this mix, we could use that in another place in our image. And since we're already focused more so on the center of the image, I think it makes sense to go ahead and add some more mix in this area. And if you think about it, this mix really is the product we're selling, and you can't see that inside the bag. So showing that product in a prominent place in the image is just a really good idea. So I think what we're gonna do here is make it look like the packages are being surrounded slightly by this mix. So that means we need to paint away some of the mix and expose the package behind it. And if we really did have mix on the countertop like we've been working with it, there's likely to be a layer of dust left by the mix over this entire countertop. So I think adding something like that would really help just pull all of these elements together. So I've got this asset of some flour dust. We're just gonna take that and scale it down so that it matches the perspective of our countertop. And one reason I picked this image is because it had a majority of the powder focused in the center. And since we have a mound of flour in our seams in the center, it seemed like a perfect match. Now to make it so where we can only see the powder and not the background, we can just set this layers blending mode to screen. As far as the composition goes, it seems like we have a lot of empty space on the right and the left. So I think we could add in a few more props just to help fill out this scene. And just to pick another object that would be generally found in the kitchen, I think something like a bowl would be pretty good. And to match the spoon and our rustic vibe, I think that bowl should be wooden as well. And here's the bowl we're gonna use. Again, I picked this because it had roughly the correct perspective, and it's made of a slightly darker wood. And because we're gonna place these objects on the outer edges of the scene, we don't want something super bright to draw our attention away from the center. And so something that doesn't have a lot of visual weight is really what we're looking for. Again, we wanna make sure that it's sized correctly, and because the bag is still our focal element, I'm gonna stick the bowl behind it. And as for the item we're gonna put on the other side, I think something like a little tin pitcher would work pretty well, and having something metal there will be a nice contrast with everything else that's wood. This looks like a pretty good pitcher to use, so I'm just gonna cut that out and we'll put it in place. So that we have our pitcher. I left that a little bit larger just to make the size make sense in comparison to everything else. One thing I don't really like about it though is that it feels a little dirty. We're going for a very rustic scene, but we wanna make sure that we balance that with things that still look appealing. And it's really just some of these browner colors that make things look a little bit more run down. So if we just add a hue saturation adjustment layer on top of that, we can select the yellow colors and desaturate those, and make them a little lighter. At this point, I think we're pretty much done with adding in extra props. The last thing that's kind of bothering me is that our background is a little bit simple in comparison to everything else. Now you definitely don't want to overcrowd the background because yet again, that pulls focus away from what you're trying to actually show off. But it is important that if you have a lot of detail in your foreground, you need to have some detail in your background as well. And currently all we have is just this really plain blank wall. So maybe just to add a little bit of visual interest, we could put something like some little cabinet doors or shutters or something like that on the back. And that'll just help break up this really horizontal pattern we've got going on. And luckily I was able to find these really cool old rustic shutters. And since generally most kitchens have a lot of windows, this seems to make perfect sense for our scene. So we'll just stick that behind everything in our foreground, and we'll expand that to make it a little larger and take up more of the background. And I did move that up quite a bit because our window's not gonna sit super close to the top of our counter, and these shutters have a lot of complexity visually, and we don't wanna overwhelm our background. We just wanna add a little bit of detail to it. And now with that in there, I think we can go ahead and start adjusting our lighting and make this whole scene feel a lot more cohesive. We can go ahead and start with these shutters. They look way out of place right now because they're just super overly bright. So the first thing we'll do is dim those down some. And as we make those darker, you can see that we have a lot of weird discoloration. So to get rid of that, we're gonna add another hue saturation layer, and this time we're just gonna colorize the entire thing. That way everything becomes pretty much a solid color. We'll just adjust the tones to get those correct, and then we can turn down the opacity of that adjustment layer just a little bit. That way the color isn't perfectly uniform, because that would never happen in real life. And it may be a little hard to tell, but our background has actually got some focus blur in it, and since these shutters are gonna be sitting right directly on top of that wall, they need to have the same amount of blur. Just a little bit though. Based on our bag mock-ups, we can see the light is actually coming from somewhere around this direction, but since I really want people to focus on the center of this scene, we're gonna fudge things a little bit and make the light come directly from the top. It's gonna be above them, but also facing down towards them. So that means most of our shadows are gonna be directly beneath our objects as well as behind them. So just to tackle these one at a time, let's go ahead and start with a spoon. First off, it's a little too saturated for the scene and it kind of draws too much attention away from the bags. So we're gonna desaturate that some. And now we can go ahead and give that spoon a shadow. And for an object like this, you can't really use a drop shadow because the curve of the shadow just doesn't really make sense for this shape. The shadow should be flat on the counter. It shouldn't have any curves like this. So instead, we're just gonna make a dark brown line across the entire bottom of the spoon. Now we can blur that line, and that starts to look more like a shadow being cast from above. And in general, the way shadows work is that the closer an object is to the surface, the darker that shadow is gonna be. And so that means where our spoon is really close to touching the counters, like here, and then towards the end of the handle, those areas are gonna be really dark. But in the middle of the handle, where it's farther from the countertop, we're gonna wanna make that shadow a little bit lighter. So we can just give that layer a mask, and then just paint away some of the darkness in that area. And because this part of the spoon is wider than the handle, the bottom of those two areas are not gonna be perfectly horizontal along the countertop. So that means our shadow needs to be slightly tilted to line up with that. Also, this area right underneath the spoon is gonna be in shadow as well. So we're just gonna add a second layer and paint some more shadow into that part. Now we'll group those layers together and then set the blending mode to multiply. That way our shadow will just make the layer underneath it darker and we can still see that texture of the countertop. And now when it comes to our powder, it looks a little flat right now, and I'd like to add some depth to that. So you can see we almost have a place where it looks like there's a divot in here. And with the addition of a little bit of lighting, we can help increase that effect. So I'm just gonna paint in a darker layer above this, and then we're gonna mask out a hard edge here in front. And the actual light in our scene is still gonna ensure that the top of this powder isn't too dark. And now moving on to our other pile of mix in the background here, we need to add some shadows on it being cast from our bags. So once again, we're just gonna paint a little bit of darkness here as we try to envision where our shadows are gonna cast from the bag onto this pile. And just as the bags cast shadow onto the mix is also gonna cast a small shadow onto the bags, mainly right where they're contacting each other. And I know a lot of these things may seem a little bit subtle, but it's really what helps make the scene look realistic in the end. And just to help separate these two piles of mixes a little more, I'm gonna make this entire back pile just a bit darker. And if you remember, our pancake mix isn't perfectly white, it's a little bit tan, so we're gonna go ahead and add in that slight color adjustment. And that can be done just by adding a solid tan layer and changing the blending mode to linear burn. So we'll just do the same thing to this front pile as well. And of course, we need to adjust the color of that entire powder layer on our countertop as well. And to kind of finish up with this area, our spoon is a little too well lit from below, so we're gonna add some shadow down there. So now I think we can move on to the bowl. We'll start by making the entire thing less bright, just to help push it to the background a little more. Now we're just gonna add some shadow to the bottom of this bowl since the light is gonna be blocked from hitting that area. Now our bag is gonna cast a shadow into that bowl, so we're gonna paint that in next. And once we got that, we can paint the shadow our bowl is casting onto the countertop. And to do that, we're just gonna paint a nice soft shadow, roughly in the form of an oval right beneath the bowl. And now we can move on to our picture over here. First things first, we're gonna make it less bright, and I'm also gonna scoot the picture back a little more towards the background. That way it's not competing so much with all of our other elements. I'm gonna add just a little more shadow to that as well. And you notice pretty much everything in our scene has a very brownish tone to it. And just to help it blend in some more, we're gonna adjust its hue some. And I really wanna push this more towards the background, so I'm just gonna strengthen the shadow along that edge. And now we can take care of the shadows on the back of the counter that's gonna be cast by all of these objects. And when I was doing that, I made sure not to completely get rid of the transition between the back of the wall and the top of the countertop. That transition has helped sell in our perspective, so we don't want to get rid of that. And for one of the finishing details, you'll notice that the shadows being cast from our bags are kind of blue. In reality, those should be more of a brown tone, so we're gonna adjust that just by putting a solid brown layer over top of those and changing the blending mode to soft light. So it looks like we have this really dramatic scene to where it's almost like a spotlight effect. In an instance like this, I think it makes sense to show some of those light rays. So what we can do is just get a brush with a low opacity and start painting in some light rays. Keeping in mind they should form that spotlight shape. And as we do this, we'll want to vary the radius of the brush. That way we just get some different ray shapes. And now we can just blur that layer, and all of a sudden we have some really nice light rays. And using different blending modes will give you slightly different looks. I think for this one I'm gonna use screen, and we definitely don't want these rays to overwhelm the scene, so it's good to dial back their intensity along some of the edges. And when I'm doing this, I generally like to lower the opacity down to 0 and then slowly raise it back up until I get a look that I like. And it's always good to zoom out and get a bird's eye view of things, so I'm just gonna turn it down some more. I think that looks a lot better. Our shutters still stick out a little bit too much. I think they look fine in the middle, but on the edges, the brightness between them and the wall doesn't quite match, so we're just gonna darken those areas up some. And as a bit of a finishing touch, a lot of times when light rays are visible, you'll see dust in them. And since our environment is full of this mixed powder, it's likely gonna be in the air, and so we can add some of that in. And to do that, you can use a spatter brush that's actually provided by Adobe. To get those brushes, if you just go to the brush menu, select Get More Brushes, it'll open a web page and you'll be able to see it and download that. And I'll be using this brush right here. I'm gonna pick a white color, and as you can see, when we start painting, we get this nice particle effect. And they'll mainly be focused where the main area of light is. And now we can adjust that blending mode to soft light, and that'll make those specks appear more so in the lighter parts and less so in the dark, which is what would happen in real life. And if the particles aren't visible enough, you can always duplicate that layer again. And if there's a few too many particles, a lot of times I'll just go back over top and mask out the ones that I don't think need to be there. And sometimes it's good to add just a little bit of blur to those particles. So since we do have this spotlight mainly affecting the middle of our image, we can add some slight shade to the outer edges of both of our bags. And just like we did to end off the other videos, I'm gonna make a merged layer of everything in the scene. We're gonna convert that to a smart object, and then apply a camera raw filter on top of that. And at this point, we can just tweak some of the colors to fine tune things and make it look exactly how we want. And then once you've done that, you can just adjust the opacity of that layer if you want to turn the effect down, which I find is usually the case. And guys, I believe that wraps up our series. I'd really love to know what you thought about all this down in the comments. I know they're a bit longer than what I normally do, but I feel like this gives me the chance to really explain my process and how I actually work on some of these projects. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you haven't already seen them, I do have a series of 5-minute designs. They're a lot shorter videos, and they go through some really interesting projects from start to finish in a really quick manner. So you can watch them here if you want to check those out. If you have any other videos you'd like me to do, just please let me know. If there's somebody that you know that you think would like this video series, feel free to share it with them. Once again, I really appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.